When I became a 70-year-old widow, I thought my son would stand by me. He didn't. He chose his wife and left me behind. That was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like a door closing in another room. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply set the table for three and waited. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and tell me where you're watching from. I've learned that silence can travel farther than anger ever could. The dining room still smelled faintly of roasted chicken and rosemary. I had followed the same recipe I'd used for decades, the one my son Daniel used to ask for every Sunday when he was a boy. Back then he would sit at the table before dinner was even ready, swinging his legs asking, "Is it done yet, Mom?" That memory felt like it belonged to someone else now. The table was set carefully. 3 plates, 3 glasses, linen napkins folded the way my late husband, Richard, always liked, simple, neat, precise. I had even taken out the good china, the one we saved for holidays. It felt appropriate. This was my first dinner as a widow. My first attempt at holding on to something that still felt like family. Richard had been gone for exactly 9 days. 9 days since I stood beside a polished wooden casket, greeting people who spoke in hushed voices and avoided my eyes. 9 days since I came home to a house that echoed when I walked through it. Every room carried a trace of him. His reading glasses on the nightstand, his coat still hanging by the door, the faint scent of his aftershave lingering in the hallway. I had told myself that tonight would be different. Tonight Daniel would come. He would sit across from me, maybe reach for my hand, maybe say something, anything, that made this new, empty life feel less unbearable. At 6:15 p.m., I checked the oven again, even though I knew everything was ready. At 6:30, I lit the candles. At 6:45, I smoothed the front of my dress and glanced at my reflection in the hallway mirror. A navy blue dress. Conservative. Familiar. The kind Richard always said made me look put together. At 7 o'clock my phone rang. I remember how quickly I reached for it, how my heart lifted just slightly at the sight of Daniel's name on the screen. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice sounded distant. Not physically, emotionally, like he was already somewhere else. "Y, sweetheart, y raplia. Dinner's ready. I made your favorite." There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. "Yeah, about that," he said. "We're not coming tonight." The words landed softly. Too softly. "Oh," I said. "Is everything all right?" Another pause. Then, "Melissa isn't really comfortable coming over right now." Melissa. My daughter-in-law. I glanced at the table. 3 plates. Still untouched. "I see," I said quietly. "It's just a lot, you know," he continued. "With everything that's happened. She thinks it's better if we give it some time." Some time. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "Of course," I said. "I understand." He exhaled as if relieved. "Thanks, Mom. We'll come by another day." Another day. "All right," I replied. We said goodbye. The call ended. And just like that, the house fell silent again. I stood there for a moment, the phone still in my hand. Then I walked back into the dining room and sat down at the table. The candles flickered gently, casting soft shadows against the walls. The food was still warm. Steam rose faintly from the mashed potatoes. Picked up my fork. Then I set it back down. Across from me, Richard's chair sat empty. To my right, Daniel's place remained untouched. I looked at that empty seat for a long time. Not confused. Not even surprised. Just aware. Because deep down, something in me had already begun to understand what my mind wasn't ready to admit. This wasn't about grief. This wasn't about timing. This was about choice. And my son had already made his. The house felt different after that call. Not louder. Not emptier. Just settled. Like something invisible had finally taken its place. I sat at the table long after the candles burned low, watching the wax drip slowly down the sides. The food cooled. The silence stretched. And for the first time since Richard passed, I didn't try to fill it. I let it stay. That night, I didn't clear the table right away. I went upstairs instead. Our bedroom still looked exactly the way it had the morning he didn't wake up. His side of the bed untouched. His slippers still angled toward the closet. I had told myself I would clean it eventually, put things away, make it easier. But not yet. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his pillow. For 42 years that space had never been empty. Give him time, Richard used to say whenever Daniel and I had disagreements. He'll come around. He's a good boy. I used to believe that without question. Back when good boy meant scraped knees and bedtime stories. Not silence and distance. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Old habits don't disappear just because life does. I made coffee. 1 cup. The same mug I'd used for years, white porcelain slightly chipped at the rim. Richard's mug was still beside it in the cabinet. I didn't touch it. The kitchen felt too big for one person. I stood by the window watching the quiet suburban street. A neighbor walked her dog. A delivery truck passed slowly. Ordinary life continued, untouched by the small collapse happening inside my home. I told myself again, it's just grief. Everyone handles it differently. That's what Daniel had meant, right? That Melissa was overwhelmed. That they needed space. That this distance was temporary. But then I remembered something. 3 months ago, before Richard got sick, I had invited them over for Easter dinner. Melissa had smiled politely on the phone and said they already had plans. Later that evening I saw photos online. A large table. Bright decorations. Daniel sitting beside her family laughing. He hadn't mentioned it. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding. Then there was Daniel's birthday last year. I had baked a cake. Chocolate with buttercream frosting, the kind he always loved. I called him that morning to ask what time they'd arrive. "Oh, Mom," he said almost casually. "We're actually going out of town this weekend. Melissa planned a little getaway." A getaway he forgot to mention. I remember standing in the kitchen holding the phone, staring at the cake I had spent hours decorating. I told myself he's busy. Life changes. It's normal. I told myself that a lot. I took a sip of my coffee and set the mug down carefully. Maybe last night wasn't an exception. Maybe it was just the clearest version of something that had been happening for a long time. Later that afternoon, I walked back into the dining room. The table was still set. The plates untouched. The napkins still folded. The candles now hardened into uneven shapes. I stood there for a moment. Then I began clearing it. One plate at a time. The sound of china stacking echoed louder than it should have. I wrapped the leftover food and placed it neatly in containers. Labeled them, even though there was no one else to eat them. Old habits. When I reached Daniel's place setting, I paused. His glass was still full. I hadn't poured the water out. I don't know why. Maybe I had believed in some small quiet way that he might still walk through the door. I picked it up slowly, carried it to the sink and poured it out. The water disappeared instantly, leaving nothing behind. That's when the thought came. Clear. Simple. Unavoidable. This wasn't new. It had just become impossible to ignore. I dried my hands with a towel and looked around the kitchen. Every surface held a memory. Every object had a story. But memories don't answer phone calls. They don't show up for dinner. And they don't choose you when it matters. I leaned against the counter, feeling the weight of that realization settle in. Not heavy. Not crushing. Just final. Somewhere along the way, without saying it out loud, my son had started building a life where I didn't quite fit anymore. And last night, for the first time, he made it clear. Not with anger. Not with cruelty. But with something far quieter. He chose her comfort over my presence. And I was left standing in a house that no longer felt like home. Top of form by the third day, I stopped expecting my phone to ring. Not because I was angry. Not even because I was hurt. But because something inside me had grown quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after you've asked the same question too many times and finally realize you don't want the answer anymore. I moved through the house slowly that morning. Not out of sadness but awareness. Every detail seemed sharper now. The ticking of the clock in the hallway. The hum of the refrigerator. The way sunlight fell across the kitchen floor. Exactly where Richard used to stand with his morning coffee. For years, this house had been full of movement. Voices. Footsteps. Small interruptions that made life feel shared. Now everything stayed exactly where I left it. No one moved my things. No one asked where I was. No one needed me. I opened the hallway closet and reached for my coat. It still brushed against Richard's when I pulled it free. I paused. Then I gently pushed his coat back into place. "I'll take care of things," I whispered, though I wasn't entirely sure what things meant anymore. Outside the air was crisp. Early spring. The kind of day that used to feel hopeful. I drove to the grocery store out of habit, not necessity. Walking through the aisles, I caught myself reaching for items Daniel liked. The brand of orange juice he always preferred. The crackers Melissa once said she enjoyed. My hand hovered over the shelf for a moment. Then I pulled it back. I didn't need those anymore. That realization didn't sting the way I expected it to. It settled. Quietly. Firmly. At the checkout line, the young cashier smiled politely. "Find everything okay?" "Yes," I said. It wasn't entirely true. But it was enough. When I got home, I carried the groceries inside and set them on the counter. Smaller portions this time. Simpler meals. I didn't need to cook for 3 anymore. I didn't even need to cook for 2. That afternoon, I decided to go through some paperwork. It wasn't something I had planned. Just felt necessary. Richard had always handled most of it: bills, accounts, insurance. Not because I couldn't, but because that had been our rhythm. Now the rhythm was gone, and I needed to learn the silence it left behind. I sat at the dining table, the same one that had been set for dinner just a few nights ago, and opened the drawer where we kept important documents. Folders. Envelopes. Carefully labeled. Richard had always been organized. I ran my fingers over his handwriting. Strong. Steady. Familiar. For a moment I allowed myself to feel it, the absence. Then I opened the first folder. Bank statements. Property records. Insurance policies. Numbers. Dates. Signatures. Things that didn't carry emotion, but defined everything around it. As I flipped through the pages, something caught my attention. A recent change. Not large. Not dramatic. Just different. An account I didn't recognize being accessed more frequently than usual. I frowned slightly. That was odd. I leaned closer, scanning the entries again. Transfers. Small ones. Regular. Not enough to cause alarm, but enough to notice. I sat back in my chair. The paper still in my hands. Maybe it was nothing. A billing adjustment. An automatic payment. There were logical explanations. There always are. But something about it didn't feel right. Not wrong. Just unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things I was beginning to understand deserved a second look. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back in the drawer. Not dismissed. Just set aside. The house was quiet again as I stood up and walked to the window. The same street. The same passing cars. The same ordinary life moving forward without interruption. But something had shifted. Not outside. Inside. For the first time since Richard passed. And since Daniel chose not to come. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was observing. Paying attention. Because slowly, piece by piece, a different kind of understanding was beginning to take shape. One that didn't rely on what people said, but on what they did. And more importantly, what they stopped doing. I folded my arms and looked out at the street a little longer. Then I said it out loud. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to hear it clearly. Something isn't right. And this time, I wasn't going to ignore it. I didn't go back to that folder right away. Not because I forgot, but because I didn't want to rush into a conclusion I wasn't ready to face. For years, I had trained myself to explain things away, to soften sharp edges, to turn discomfort into patience. It was easier that way, safer. But now, there was no one left to protect me from the truth except myself. And I was beginning to wonder if I had been doing that for far too long. That evening, I made myself a simple dinner. Soup. Toast. Nothing that required much thought. I ate at the kitchen counter instead of the dining table. Felt more honest. No empty chairs. No expectations. Just me. After I finished, I washed the dishes immediately. Dried them. Put them away. Every movement precise. Controlled. Then I stood there for a moment, staring at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. 70 years old. A widow. A mother. And suddenly none of those roles seemed to mean what they used to. I turned off the kitchen light and walked back into the living room. Richard's armchair sat exactly where it always had, slightly angled toward the television. A folded blanket draped neatly over the arm. I had straightened it 2 days ago. It didn't need straightening again. But I did it anyway. My fingers lingered on the fabric a second longer than necessary. "You always said I trusted too easily," I murmured. I could almost hear his quiet chuckle. Not unkind, just knowing. That night I didn't turn on the television. I sat in silence. And I thought. About Daniel. About Melissa. About all the small moments I had dismissed over the years. The missed calls. The shortened visits. The polite distance that slowly replaced warmth. At the time, each one had seemed insignificant on its own. But now they were beginning to connect. Like pieces of a puzzle I had never intended to solve. The next morning I went back to the drawer. This time I didn't hesitate. I took out the same folder and sat down at the dining table. The sunlight fell across the papers, making the printed numbers sharper, harder to ignore. I flipped through the statements again. Slowly, carefully, the same pattern appeared. Small transfers. Consistent. Quiet. I followed the account numbers more closely this time. And then I saw it. A name. Not unfamiliar. Just unexpected. Melissa. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I checked again. Same account. Same recipient. Repeated over time. Not once. Not twice. Many times. My hands didn't shake. My breathing didn't change. But something inside me settled into place. So this was what space meant. This was what not comfortable looked like. Not distance. Not grief. Control. I leaned back in my chair, the paper still in front of me. Richard had always handled these accounts. But after he got sick, after the hospital visits started, there had been a period where Daniel stepped in to help. Just temporarily. That's what he said. "I'll take care of things, Mom. You don't need to worry about paperwork right now." I had been grateful, relieved even, felt like support, like love. Now, sitting there in the quiet of that same house, I saw it differently. Not all at once, but clearly enough. I stood up and walked to the window again. The street looked the same, unchanged, but I wasn't looking at it the same way anymore. Behind me, the folder lay open on the table. No longer just paperwork. Not just numbers. Evidence. I crossed my arms slowly, feeling the weight of that word settle in. Not heavy. Not overwhelming. Just undeniable. For years, I had believed that love meant giving without question. Trusting without checking. Showing up no matter what. But standing there in the quiet aftermath of everything I had lost, my husband at my place in my son's life, and now perhaps something more, I realized something else. Giving without awareness isn't kindness. It's permission. And I had given it freely. For too long. I turned back toward the table. The papers waited exactly where I left them. This time I didn't look away. "This isn't a misunderstanding," I said quietly. And for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't speaking as someone who had been left behind. I was speaking as someone who had finally begun to see. And once you see something clearly, you can't pretend it isn't there anymore. I didn't call Daniel that day. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even close the folder right away. I simply sat there and let the truth settle. It didn't crash into me the way people imagine these moments do. There was no dramatic realization. No sudden wave of anger, just a quiet shift. Like finally putting on a pair of glasses and realizing the world had been blurry for a very long time. Melissa's name was still on the page. Neat. Clear. Repeated. I traced one of the transactions with my finger. A few $100s here. Another transfer there. Always small enough to avoid attention. Always regular enough to form a pattern. I thought back to those months when Richard was in and out of the hospital. The appointments, the medications, the long nights where sleep came in fragments. Daniel had stepped in then. "I'll handle the finances, Mom," he said. "You just focus on Dad." And I had. Completely. Without question. Because that's what mothers do when their children offer help. They trust. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that memory play out again, but this time from a distance. Not as a participant. As an observer. The tone of his voice, the way Melissa stayed quiet but present, the speed at which decisions were made on my behalf. At the time it had felt like support. Now it felt organized. Intentional. I opened my eyes and looked back at the paper. This wasn't a single mistake. It wasn't confusion. It was a system. And systems don't happen by accident. I stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen. The house was still. Uninterrupted. I poured myself a glass of water, my movements steady, deliberate. Then I leaned lightly against the counter. For 70 years I had believed that love within a family was something solid. Something you could stand on without checking the ground beneath your feet. But standing there in my own kitchen I realized something else. Love can be real. And still be used. That thought didn't make me bitter. It made me careful. I carried the glass back to the table and sat down again. This time I pulled out another folder. Legal documents. Richard's will. I hadn't opened it since the day it was read aloud. I remembered sitting in that office, my hands folded neatly in my lap, listening as the attorney spoke in calm, measured tones. Everything had been straightforward, simple, secure. Richard had made sure of that. Or at least that's what I believed. I flipped through the pages slowly. Names, allocations, signatures. Everything appeared exactly as I remembered. But now, after what I had just seen, I wasn't reading for comfort. I was reading for accuracy. Details I once skimmed over now held weight. Language I once trusted without question now demanded attention. I noticed a section near the end. An addendum. Dated shortly before Richard's condition worsened. I paused. That was strange. I didn't remember discussing any changes. I leaned closer, scanning the text. It was subtle, carefully worded, but the implication was clear enough. In the event that I became unable or unwilling to manage certain financial responsibilities, temporary authority could be delegated. To Daniel. My fingers rested on the page. Unable or unwilling. Such simple words. So easy to justify. So easy to use. I sat back slowly, the weight of it settling into something sharper now. Not just awareness. Understanding. This hadn't started after Richard passed. It had started before. Quietly. Gradually. Piece by piece. And I had been right there the entire time. Trusting. Signing. Allowing. I looked around the room again. The same walls. The same furniture. The same life I had built over decades. But now I could see the gaps. The places where control had shifted without me noticing. The moments where decisions were made for me, instead of with me. Closed the folder gently and placed it on top of the first one. Two pieces of the same story. Two confirmations. I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel the urge to call anyone, because this wasn't a moment for reaction. It was a moment for clarity. And clarity, I was beginning to understand, was far more powerful than emotion. I folded my hands on the table and sat there in silence for a while, letting everything align. Not rushing. Not resisting. Just seeing. They thought I wouldn't notice, I said quietly. Not with anger. Just fact. Then, after a pause, I added, almost to myself, they thought I wouldn't understand. I stood up slowly, walked to the window, looked out at the same quiet street. Nothing had changed out there. But inside this house, everything had. And for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't the one being left out of the story anymore. I was the one beginning to control it. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because my mind had finally stopped avoiding what it had known for a long time. There's a difference between suspicion and confirmation. Suspicion whispers. Confirmation sits with you in silence and refuses to leave. By morning I wasn't confused anymore. I was clear. And clarity has a way of changing how you move through the world. I got dressed earlier than usual. Not in anything special. Just a simple beige coat, low heels, and the same handbag I'd carried for years. But there was something different in the way I held myself. More deliberate. Less waiting. I picked up my keys and paused for a second at the door. For decades, I had walked out of this house thinking about others. What needed to be done. Who needed me. What role I had to fulfill. That morning, I stepped outside thinking only one thing. I need to understand everything. The bank wasn't far. A 10-minute drive. I had been there countless times before. Usually with Richard, occasionally with Daniel after Richard got sick. Familiar place. Familiar people. Or so I thought. The automatic doors opened with a soft hum as I stepped inside. The air was cool, conditioned, clean, controlled. I walked up to the front desk. "Good morning," the young woman said with a practiced smile. "Good morning," I replied. "I'd like to review some account activity." She nodded and typed something into her computer. "Of course. Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said calmly. "But I believe this shouldn't take long." There was a brief pause. Then she smiled again. "Let me see who's available." I sat down in one of the waiting chairs. Across the room, a man in a suit was discussing a loan. A couple stood by the counter speaking in low voices. Everything felt normal, ordinary. And yet, for me, this was the beginning of something entirely different. A few minutes later, a middle-aged man approached me. "Mrs. Carter?" he asked. I nodded. "I'm James. Please come with me." His office was small but tidy. A desk, 2 chairs, a computer screen angled slightly away. I sat down. "How can I help you today?" he asked. I placed my handbag gently on my lap. "I'd like a detailed review of my accounts," I said. "All activity over the past 6 months." He nodded, clicking through a few screens. "Of course," he said. "Is there something specific you're concerned about?" I looked at him steadily. "Yes," I replied. "There is." He didn't press further. Good. The screen reflected faintly in his glasses as he scrolled. Then after a moment he slowed down. "All right," he said carefully. "I see the transactions you're referring to." So he saw them too. That was enough to confirm I wasn't imagining anything. "Can you explain them?" I asked. He hesitated. "Some of these transfers were authorized through joint access," he said. "It appears your son, Daniel, was granted limited control over certain accounts." Limited. Such a gentle word. "And these transfers?" I continued. He clicked again. "They were directed to another account listed under Melissa Carter." There it was. Spoken out loud. Not suspicion anymore. Not interpretation. Fact. I nodded once. "Were there any restrictions on these transfers?" I asked. "Technically, no," he said. "The authorization allowed for discretionary movement of funds within certain limits." Discretionary. Another soft word. I leaned back slightly in my chair. So as long as the amount stayed within a certain range, no alerts were triggered. That's correct. Of course it was. Careful. Measured. Planned. I folded my hands together. "Can this access be revoked?" I asked. "Yes," he said immediately. "At any time." No hesitación. No complicación. Just like that. For a moment I said nothing. I simply let that answer sit between us. At any time. I had given that access. And at any time, I could take it back. "I'd like to revoke it," I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. Simply settled. "Of course," he replied, already typing. Within seconds, the permissions that had quietly allowed money to leave my account, piece by piece, unnoticed, were gone. Just like that. I watched the screen as he finalized the change. No alarm. No annoncement. Just a silent correction. "Is there anything else I can assist you with?" he asked. I considered that for a moment. Then I nodded. "Yes," I said. "I'd also like to be notified of any future access requests." "Absolutely." He made the adjustment. Another quiet layer of protection. I stood up, smoothing the front of my coat. "Thank you," I said. "You're welcome, Mrs. Carter." I walked out of the bank the same way I had entered. Calm. Measured. But something had shifted. Not dramatically. Not visibly. But completely. Because for the first time since Richard passed, since Daniel stepped in, since Melissa became part of decisions I never realized she was part of, I had taken something back. Control. Not loudly. Not emotionally. But precisely. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. "They thought I wouldn't notice," I said quietly. Then after a pause, "They thought I wouldn't act." I started the engine. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for what they would do next. I was already thinking about what I would do. I didn't tell Daniel what I had done. Not that day. Not the next. And not because I was afraid of his reaction, but because I wanted to see something first. How people behave when the quiet advantage they've relied on suddenly disappears. The house felt different again that afternoon. Not lighter, not heavier, just clearer. I made tea and sat by the window, the same place I had stood so many times before, watching the same street. Cars passed. A child rode a bike down the sidewalk. Somewhere a dog barked. Life continued. But now I wasn't watching it to pass time. I was watching while waiting. Not for an apology. Not for an explanation. But for a shift. Came sooner than I expected. The next morning my phone rang. Daniel. I looked at the screen for a moment before answering. Not rushing. Not hesitating. Just choosing. Hi, Mom, he said. His voice was different. Subtle. Controlled. But I could hear it. Tension.
Daniel. Replied calmly.
There was a brief pause. Hey, I was just going over some things this morning. And it looks like there might be an issue with one of the accounts. I said nothing. I let the silence stretch just enough. What kind of issue? I asked. Well, some of the access settings seem to have changed, he said carefully. I can't move funds the way I used to. Of course he couldn't. I see, I replied. Another pause. Did you update something? He asked. The question was casual, but underneath it was something else. I folded my hands in my lap. Yes, I said simply.
No explanation. No apology.
Just fact. Oh, he said. Okay. I was just trying to take care of things for you, Mom. You know that. I looked out the window as he spoke. The same calm tone. The same careful words. I'm sure you were, I said. And I meant it. In his mind, perhaps he was. There was a slight shift in his voice now. Well, some payments might get delayed if I don't have access, he added. Melissa mentioned. There it was. Melissa. Always just behind the sentence. I didn't interrupt. I let him finish. That it might be easier if we just keep things the way they were. Easier. For who? I took a slow breath. Daniel, I said, my voice steady. I've decided to manage my accounts myself from now on. Silence. Not long, but different. More noticeable this time. I just thought, he started. I know, I said gently. And I did. I knew exactly what he thought. That I wouldn't notice. That I wouldn't question. That I would continue as I always had. But things have changed, I added. Another pause. Then softer this time. Are you upset about something? It was almost convincing. Almost. I looked down at my hands. For years those hands had cooked for him, cleaned for him, comforted him. Signed papers without hesitation. Given without measure. Now they rested quietly. Still. No, I said. And again I meant it. I wasn't upset. I was aware. I just think it's time I take care of things myself. He exhaled lightly. Okay, he said. If that's what you want. That's what I want. Such an interesting way to put it. As if this were preference. Not correction. We ended the call shortly after.
No argument.
No raised voices. Just distance. But this time it wasn't the kind that leaves you behind. It was the kind you choose. I set my phone down on the table and sat there for a moment. Listening. Not to the silence. But to what had just happened beneath it. He hadn't asked why. Not really. He hadn't questioned the transactions. Hadn't expressed surprise. Only inconvenience. That told me everything I needed to know. I stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen. Poured myself another cup of tea. My movements steady. Unhurried. They noticed, I said quietly. Then, after a pause. But not for the reason I once hoped. I carried the cup back to the window and looked outside again. The same street. The same world. But I wasn't standing in it the same way anymore. Because now the roles had shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But undeniably. For the first time. They were the ones adjusting to me. And I was no longer adjusting to them. Top of form, bottom of form, I didn't expect them to come so soon. But they did. 3 days later, just after noon, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I was in the kitchen rinsing a cup when the sound reached me. Tires on gravel. An engine shutting off. A car door closing. Then another. I dried my hands slowly.
No rush. No surprise.
I walked to the window and looked out. Daniel's car. And Melissa, stepping out of the passenger side. Of course, they never came separately anymore. I watched as they approached the front door. Melissa walked slightly ahead, her posture straight, composed. Daniel followed half a step behind, his shoulders tight, his expression unreadable from this distance. I turned away from the window before they knocked. Not to avoid them, but because I didn't need to watch them arrive. I already knew why they were here. The knock came. 2 short taps. Then a pause. Then one more. Polite. Measured. I walked to the door and opened it. "Hi, Mom," Daniel said. "Hello," I replied. Melissa gave a small smile. We were in the area and thought we'd stop by. In the area. I stepped aside.
Come in.
They entered the house like guests, not like family. Melissa glanced around briefly, as if checking whether anything had changed. It hadn't. Not in ways she could see. "Would you like some tea?" I asked. Daniel hesitated. Sure." Melissa nodded. "That would be nice." I walked to the kitchen without waiting for more conversation. The kettle was already half full. I turned it on and reached for 3 cups. Not the good china this time. Just the everyday set. Behind me I could hear their voices, low, careful, controlled. Whispers. Coordination. I didn't need to hear the words. I already understood the rhythm. When I returned, they were sitting at the dining table. The same table. The same seats. But something about it felt rearranged. Not physically, but in meaning. I placed the cups down one by one. Melissa wrapped her hands around hers immediately, though she didn't drink. Daniel looked at me. "Mom, we just wanted to talk," he said. "Of course you did." I sat down across from them.
"I'm listening," he replied.
There was a brief glance between them. Melissa spoke first. "We noticed some changes in the accounts," she said, her tone calm, almost gentle. "And we were a little concerned." Concerned. I folded my hands lightly on the table. "There's no need to be," I said. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "It's just that we've been helping manage things," he added. "And sudden changes can complicate things." Complicate. I nodded once. "I understand." Another pause. Then Melissa again. "We just want to make sure everything is handled properly. Especially now with everything you've been through." There it was. The soft edge. The careful phrasing. Concern wrapped around control. I looked at her for a moment. Not with anger. Not even with judgment. Just observation. "I appreciate that," I said. And I did. In a way. Because now everything was finally visible. Daniel relaxed slightly, as if that response had gone the way he expected. "So maybe we can just go back to how things were," he suggested. "At least for now." Picked up my cup. Took a small sip. Set it back down. "No," I said. The word wasn't loud. But it didn't need to be. The room shifted. Just slightly. Melissa's fingers tightened around her cup. Daniel blinked once. "I've decided to handle my own affairs," I continued. Moving forward. There was a silence after that. Not confused. Not shocked. Just recalculating. Melissa spoke again, this time a little more carefully. "We're only trying to help." I nodded. "I know." And again I meant it. Help to them probably looked exactly like this. Structured. Controlled. Quietly beneficial. "But I don't need that kind of help anymore," I added. Daniel leaned back in his chair. His jaw tightened slightly. "Mom, you don't have to do everything alone," he said. I looked at him. Really looked at him. At the man he had become. Not the boy I raised. Not the child who once needed me for everything. But someone who had learned different priorities. "I'm not alone," I said calmly. And for the first time that felt true. Not because someone was standing beside me, but because I was finally standing with myself. Another silence. He didn't argue. Didn't push. Because somewhere in that moment he understood. Not everything. But enough. Melissa set her cup down carefully. "If you change your mind," she said, "we're here." "Of course you are." I gave a small nod. "I'll keep that in mind." They stayed for a few more minutes. Polite conversation. Surface level. Nothing real. Then they stood up to leave. At the door, Daniel hesitated. "Call me if you need anything," he said. I looked at him. "I will," I replied. But we both knew. That meant something different now. I closed the door gently after they left. No Islam. No sound. Just a quiet end to something that had already been ending for a long time. I stood there for a moment. Then I turned and walked back into the house. Everything looked the same, but it didn't feel the same, because now there was no confusion left. No doubt. No illusion of what this was. They came to fix what broke for them, I said softly. Then I walked to the window one more time. The car pulled away. Slowly. Without looking back. And I'm no longer here to make things easier for them. I watched until they disappeared down the street. Then I turned away. Not waiting. Not wondering. Just done. I didn't call a lawyer immediately. Not because I didn't know I should. But because I wanted to understand the full shape of things before I made any final moves. There's a difference between reacting and positioning. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't interested in reacting. I was interested in seeing everything clearly. That afternoon, I went back to the dining table. The folders were still there. Exactly where I had left them. I sat down and opened them again. This time I wasn't looking for confirmation. I already had that. I was looking for patterns, timelines, connections. I took out a notepad, something I hadn't used in years for anything other than grocery lists, and began writing. Dates of transfers, amounts, frequency. Then I wrote down something else. Moments. Richard's first hospital visit. The week Daniel offered to help. The timing of the addendum in the will. I placed them side by side. Numbers and memories. And slowly they began to align. Too neatly. Too consistently. This hadn't been sudden. It hadn't been emotional. It had been gradual. Structured. Almost careful enough to look accidental. Almost. I leaned back slightly, looking at the page in front of me. For years, I had believed that distance in a family happens naturally. People grow. They change. They move on. But this wasn't distance. This was redirection. Quietly shifting control, while keeping everything looking intact. I tapped the pen lightly against the table. They didn't push me out, I said softly. They just moved things around until I no longer stood in the center. And I had allowed it. Not out of weakness, but out of trust. That distinction mattered now, because it meant something important. If trust had been given, it could also be withdrawn. I closed the notepad and sat there for a moment, thinking, not about what they had done, but about what I would do next. Later that evening, I made a phone call. Not to Daniel, not to anyone in the family, to someone I hadn't spoken to in years. "Hello," a voice answered. "Hi, Margaret," I said. "This is Evelyn Carter." There was a brief pause, then warmth. "Evelyn? Oh my goodness, it's been so long." Margaret had been my friend long before Melissa entered the picture. Long before Daniel's life became something I only saw from the outside. She had also been a paralegal for over 30 years. "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time," I said. "Not at all," she replied. "Is everything all right?" I looked around the quiet house. The same walls, the same life, but no longer the same position within it. "I think I need to understand a few things," I said carefully. Her tone shifted. Not alarmed, but attentive. "What kind of things?" "Legal ones." There was a short silence. Then she said gently, "All right, tell me what's going on." I didn't tell her everything. Not yet. Just enough. The account access. The transfers. The addendum. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "Evelyn," she said, "you did the right thing by calling." I didn't respond right away, because I wasn't looking for reassurance. I was listening for direction. "You need to speak with an attorney," she continued. "Someone who can review everything formally. Not just the accounts, your estate, your permissions, all of it." I nodded even though she couldn't see me. "I thought so," I said. "And Evelyn," she added, her voice softer now, "don't assume this is small just because it was done quietly." I looked down at my hands. "I don't," I replied. "Not anymore." She gave me the name of a firm. Someone she trusted. Someone experienced. I wrote it down carefully. Thank you, I said. Of course, she replied. And Evelyn? Yes. Take your time. But don't wait too long. I understood what she meant. Timing matters. Not for emotion. For leverage. We said goodbye shortly after. I set the phone down gently and sat there in silence. No rus. No panique. Just movement. Quiet, deliberate movement forward. I picked up the notepad again and added one more line at the bottom. Attorney tomorrow. Then I closed it. For years, I had been part of a story where decisions were made around me. For me. Without me realizing it. But now, that story was changing. Not because I raised my voice. Not because I confronted anyone. But because I had started asking the right questions. And once you ask the right questions, the answers don't stay hidden for long. I stood up, turned off the light in the dining room and walked upstairs. The house was quiet again. But it no longer felt empty. It felt steady. Because for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't just understanding what had been done to me. I was preparing for what I would do next. Top of form, bottom of form. The next morning, I didn't hesitate. Got dressed the same way I had the day I went to the bank. Simple, composed, intentional. A dark coat this time. Slightly more structured. Not for appearance. For clarity. I picked up my handbag, checked that I had the documents I needed, and paused briefly in the hallway. 4 years, I had walked out of this house reacting to life as it came. Today, I was stepping out with purpose. The law office was downtown. A quiet building. Clean lines.
No unnecessary decoration.
The kind of place where everything felt measured before it was spoken. I arrived 10 minutes early. Old habit. Inside, the receptionist greeted me with a polite smile. Good morning. Do you have an appointment? Yes, I said. Evelyn Carter. I'm here to see Mr. Lawson. She nodded and gestured toward a seating area. Please have a seat. He'll be with you shortly. I sat down, placing my handbag neatly beside me. Across the room, a clock ticked softly. A man flipped through a magazine. A woman typed quietly at her desk. Everything calm. Everything controlled. Exactly what I needed. A few minutes later, a door opened. Mrs. Carter, a voice called. I stood. I'm Daniel Lawson. Please come in. His office was larger than I expected, but not imposing. Shelves lined with files. A desk cleared except for a laptop and a notepad. He gestured for me to sit. What can I help you with today? He asked. I didn't rush into it. I opened my bag, took out the folders, and placed them on the desk one by one. I believe I need a full review of my financial and legal situation, I said. He nodded, attentive. All right. Tell me what's concerning you. So I did. Not emotionally. Not dramatically. Just clearly. The account access. The transfers. The timeline. The addendum. I spoke the way I had begun to think, structured, precise, without unnecessary weight. He listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Not awkward. Evaluative. Then he leaned back slightly. You were right to come in, he said. I met his gaze. I assumed as much. He gave a small nod. What you're describing suggests that control over your financial assets may have been extended beyond what you fully intended, he continued. Not necessarily illegal on the surface, but potentially problematic depending on how it was obtained and used. Careful words. Measured. But clear enough. And the will? I asked. He opened the folder and reviewed the addendum. His expression didn't change. But his eyes slowed. This clause, he said, tapping lightly on the page, is broad. It allows for discretionary interpretation of your capacity. Meaning? I asked. Meaning, he replied calmly, that under certain circumstances, someone could argue that you were unable to manage your affairs and step in with authority. I let that sit. Not surprising, just confirmed. Would that be easy to challenge? I asked. He considered that. It depends on timing, documentation, and intent, he said. But more importantly, he paused slightly, you still have full capacity now. I nodded once. Ido. Then the focus isn't on undoing the past, he continued. It's on securing your position moving forward. That was the first sentence that mattered most. Not undoing. Securing. I folded my hands. What would that involve? I asked. He turned his notepad slightly toward himself and began outlining. First, we review and potentially revise your will. Remove or redefine any ambiguous clauses. I listened. Second, we ensure all financial access is explicitly controlled and documented. Already done. Third, he added, we may consider establishing safeguards, legal structures that prevent unauthorized influence or access in the future. Safeguards. I understood. Not barriers. Boundaries. And Daniel? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Careful again. That depends on what you want your relationship with him to look like, he said. I appreciated that answer, because it didn't assume anything. I'm not here to punish anyone, I said. He nodded. I didn't think you were. I'm here to make sure I'm not positioned out of my own life again. That was the truth. Simple. Final. He wrote something down. Then everything we do will reflect that, he said. We spent the next hour going through details. Not rushing. Not skipping. Every account. Every clause. Every possibility. By the time I stood up to leave, nothing felt uncertain anymore. Not because everything was solved, but because everything was now visible, actionable. As I gathered my things, he spoke again. Mrs. Carter, he said, you came in at the right time. I looked at him. Why do you say that? Because you still have control, he replied. And more importantly, you've chosen to use it. I gave a small nod. That won't change. I walked out of the office the same way I had. Walked in. Calm. Steady. But this time with direction. Outside the air felt different. Not warmer. Not lighter. Just clearer. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment before heading to my car. They thought they had time, I said quietly. Then I opened the car door. And now so do I. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something happening to me. It felt like something I was shaping. Quietly. Deliberately. One decision at a time. I didn't tell them about the lawyer. Not because I was hiding anything, but because some decisions don't need witnesses. They need time. The house had settled into a new rhythm by then. Quieter than before. Simpler. More intentional. I woke up when I wanted. Ate when I felt like it. Moved through each room without the invisible pull of expectation. 4 years, my days had been shaped by other people's needs. Now they were shaped by clarity. And clarity has a way of making everything else fall into place. A week passed before Daniel called again. This time his voice carried something different. Less control. More uncertainty. Hi, Mom, he said. Hello, Daniel. There was a pause. I was thinking maybe we could have dinner sometime, he offered. Just the three of us. The three of us. I stood by the kitchen counter, my fingers resting lightly against the surface. Why? I asked. Not sharply. Not suspiciously. Just directly. Another pause. I don't know, he said. It's been a while. Thought it might be good. Good. Such a simple word. I looked out the window as he spoke. The same street. The same passing cars. But I wasn't the same person standing there anymore. All right, I said. And I meant it. Not because I was hoping for something, but because I was ready. We agreed on Sunday evening. My house. Of course. I didn't prepare the way I used to.
No y la verat mil.
No perfect table setting. Just something simple. Roasted vegetables. Chicken. Bread. Enough. When they arrived, I noticed it immediately. The difference. Melissa's smile was more careful this time. Measured. Watching. Daniel quieter. Observing. They stepped inside and for a brief moment no one spoke. Then the usual greetings. Polite. Controlled. We sat down at the table. The same table that had once felt like the center of everything. Now it felt like a place of truth. We ate in near silence at first. Not uncomfortable. Just aware. Halfway through the meal, Daniel set his fork down. Mom, he said. I've been meaning to ask, are you planning to make any changes to things? Things. I looked at him. Really looked at him. What kind of changes? I asked. He hesitated. Then financial. Legal. That kind of stuff. There it was. No mention of feelings. No mention of distance. Just structure. I placed my fork down gently. Yes, I said. The word landed clearly between us. Melissa's hand paused slightly on her glass. Daniel nodded once. Okay, he said. That makes sense. Does it? I leaned back slightly in my chair. I've already started, I added. Silence. Not long, but enough. Melissa spoke this time. We just want to make sure everything is fair, she said. Fair. I let that word sit for a moment. Then I nodded. I agree. And I did. Fairness, I had learned, isn't about equal giving. It's about clear boundaries. Daniel shifted slightly. You know, we've always tried to help, he said. I didn't respond right away. Because this wasn't about arguing intentions. It was about acknowledging reality. I know, I said finally. And again I meant it. Help can look very different depending on where you're standing. But I've realized something, I continued. They both looked at me now. Fully attentive. I've spent most of my life making sure everyone else was taken care of, I said calmly. Without asking whether I was being included in the decisions that affected me.
No acquiescen.
Just truth. Daniel's expression tightened slightly. Melissa remained still. I'm not doing that anymore, I added. The room didn't react. But something in it shifted. Subtly. Permanently. Daniel nodded slowly. Okay, he said. Not agreement. Not resistance. Just acknowledgement. We finished dinner after that. Conversation stayed light. Surface level. But underneath it, everything had already been said. When they stood to leave, Daniel lingered again by the door. Mom, he said, I hope you know we care about you. I looked at him. I believe you do, I replied. And I did. Care just wasn't the same as respect. He nodded. Melissa gave a small, polite smile. Then they left. I closed the door quietly behind them. No, wait.
No hesitación.
Just completion. I walked back into the dining room. The table was still set. Half-empty plates. Glasses with a little water left. Signs of a meal that had happened. But more importantly, signs of something that had changed. I began clearing the table slowly. One plate at a time.
No rush. No heaviness.
Just movement. They're adjusting, I said softly. Then I paused, holding one of the plates in my hands. But not because they understand. I carried it to the kitchen, set it down, and continued. They're adjusting because I finally do. And that made all the difference. The house felt different after that dinner. Not because anything had been fixed, but because nothing was uncertain anymore. I woke up the next morning without that familiar weight, the quiet question that had followed me for years. Where do I stand in my own family? I already knew the answer. And more importantly, I had done something about it. The sunlight came through the kitchen window the same way it always did. Soft, steady, unchanged. I made my coffee, 1 cup, sat at the table, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't look at the empty chairs. I didn't need to, because they no longer defined anything. Later that week, I returned to Mr. Lawson's office. Not with questions this time, with decisions. We finalized everything. The will rewritten. Clear. Direct.
No vague clauses.
No room for interpretation. The accounts fully secured. No shared access.
No silent permissions.
And the safeguards put in place. Not as punishment, but as protection. Not from strangers. From assumptions. From quiet overreach. From the kind of help that slowly replaces your voice with someone else's. When it was done, he handed me the final documents. All set, he said. I nodded. Thank you. I didn't feel relief. I felt alignment. Everything now matched what I understood. And that mattered more than anything. When I got home, I placed the documents in the same drawer where everything had started. Same place. Different meaning. This time, nothing inside that drawer could be used without me knowing. Without me choosing. That evening, my phone rang again. Daniel. I looked at the screen for a moment. Then I answered. Hi, Mom, he said. Hello, Daniel. There was a pause. I just wanted to check in, he said. See how you're doing. I walked slowly toward the window. I'm doing well, I replied. And it was true. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was clear. That's good, he said. Another pause. Then more carefully. Have you made any decisions about things? I smiled slightly, not out of amusement, but recognition. Yes, I said. Silence. Not surprised. Just processing. I've taken care of everything, I added. No details.
No explanation.
Just a boundary. I see, he said. His voice was quieter now. Different. Less certain. I just want to make sure you're okay, he said. I looked out at the street again. The same world. The same life. But no longer the same position within it. I am, I replied. And after a moment I added, and I will be. We ended the call shortly after.
No tensión.
No conflict. Just distance. But this time it didn't feel like loss. Felt like space. The kind you choose. I set the phone down and stood there for a while, thinking, not about what had happened, but about what it meant. For 70 years I had believed that being a mother meant always staying, always giving, always adjusting, even when things didn't feel right, even when something inside you whispered that you were being slowly moved aside. But now, I understood something different. Love doesn't mean disappearing, and family doesn't mean surrendering your place in your own life. I turned away from the window and walked through the house. Each room felt the same, but I didn't move through them the same way anymore. There was no hesitation, no waiting, no quiet hoping to be included, just presence. My presence. I stopped in the dining room. The table was clean, empty, ready, not for others, for whatever I chose next. I rested my hand lightly on the back of the chair, the same chair I had once saved for Daniel. Then I pulled it out and sat down, not as someone waiting, but as someone who had finally arrived. He chose his wife, I said softly. Then I looked around the room. Calm, steady,
Mine.
So I chose myself. And this time, I didn't look back. Thank you for listening to this story. That if it meant something to you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need it. Your support helps me keep telling stories like this. Bottom of form.